Happy Wednesday, everyone. This is your host, Martinez. Welcome to the Standard Podcast. And today's Wednesday, the middle of the week. Here it is. And how's your day been? How has the work week been treating you thus far? Being that we're in the middle of the week, right? Monday, getting into the groove of things, having to, maneuver certain things because we're coming out of the weekend. Tuesday, now gaining some steam. Now Wednesday comes and there may be some hiccups, forks in the road, decisions to be made, tasks to be carried out. So how's your week been thus far? Drop it in the comment for me. You know, everybody wants power, but very few people are willing to go through what's required to be trusted with the power that they receive. But let me correct something very early. Power isn't something that you step into, it's something that you're processed for. And if you misunderstand the process, then you'll walk away from the very thing that was designed to prepare you. I want to kind of set some framework a little bit if I can. You know, this week, what people call Holy Week. Most people they look forward to Easter eggs and the Easter bunny. Some people are looking forward to car shows and the pathway to the cross. And what's significant about this is that I always pay attention to the weather around this time of the year. If you ever pay attention during this time, the weather gets a little gloomy. And the closer that it gets to 3 days before Resurrection Sunday, it's more gloomy. The waves are more choppier and the breeze is, more windy. All these different climate changes and different things are happening in the earth. But I admire it because I believe it is a sign for us to remember remember what it took to go through the process of obtaining all power. You know, that's what this week represents for me. It represents a week that a great sacrifice was made, but not only sacrifice, but a week where leadership was shown. You know, I know that most people see this as a moment in history, and rightfully so it is. But I see it as a blueprint, not just of sacrifice, but what it actually takes to walk in real authority. Now, I definitely want to walk down a couple of scenes or scenarios for you, um, speaking about the pathway to the cross. And if I could kind of title this, I probably would just paraphrase this with saying, dying to lead. Dying to lead. I think that's a good one. Christ, he enters the city, Jerusalem, and people are celebrating him and they're praising him. They're welcoming him. But what they didn't understand is that their expectation didn't match his assignment. See, it's not about you being praised publicly and being applauded and being recognized. Because the first lesson in leadership is shown is that it's not always about you as a leader. Just because people celebrate you doesn't mean that they understand you or they're even committed to you. So, if I could speak a little bit, Luke 22 and 48, was betrayal. And the betrayal didn't come from the outside, it came from within. Matthew 26 and 14 through 15, it tells us how Judas, one of the 12 disciples, agrees to hand Christ over. So now we're seeing that there's an internal conflict. And the internal conflict in this moment is, doing what you're called to do, but then feeling the weight of it. And real leadership is revealed right here. Real leadership is when you feel one thing, but then your assignment says something completely different. And if you're not grounded, betrayal will make you abandon your purpose. And here's what that teaches us is that access does not always equal alignment. Just because someone is near to you doesn't mean that they're for you. How many of us heard the statement that it's always the closest ones? We hear that quite often. It's always the one you know. And in this segment, or in this manner, it was. It was one of the 12 that Christ knew. But it was an inner circle conflict. And next, we see that it gets a bit real. Matthew 26, he goes into the garden and he's praying. Prays to his Father, and he says, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet, not as I will, but your will be done. And that's not weakness, but that's just awareness. And how many of us would, be willing to say that, knowing that you're about to be handed off to the slaughter and, crucified and, ridiculed. How many are willing to accept that and take that on the chin and say, it's okay. Let them, do what they're going to do. It's fine. Because there's always going to be a moment where you fully understand what your calling is. But then there's moments where you just don't understand what it's going to cost you either. In that moment, you have to decide. Do you choose comfort or do you choose purpose? Isaiah 53 and 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted. Yet he didn't open his mouth. Now, this is where, this gets difficult because being misunderstood, being misrepresented, and still maintaining composure. Wow. Because power, that just proves that power isn't how loud you are, but it's proven on how disciplined you remain when you could respond. This is exactly where most of us disqualify ourselves, right? We have this mentality that I'm not going to let no one disrespect me, or I'm not going to take that from anyone. But sometimes silence is the best answer and the best response. Not because of inferiority, but because it shows your control emotionally, intellectually, as well as physically. True leadership. See, even when it hurts, the decision has to be, do I align myself with the standard of discipline or comfort? In other words, am I going to get in my feelings? John 10, Christ made a statement. He said, "No one takes my life, but I lay it down on my own accord." So that meant, what looked like a loss was actually power being controlled. He controlled power. Standing before the Sanhedrin council and going through the ridicule, the betrayal, he stayed and he remained grounded during this time. So I want to show you something that is quite significant. And in this, here's what's significant is that now here is this person that we've been ridiculing going before trial. Now, this is what I want to call silent strength. Because here comes the accusation. Here's the false narratives. The public pressure. People judging without understanding his assignment or even understanding the facts. And I think many of us go through that. Sometimes we are, misunderstood, and people draw their own conclusion about us, developing their own false narratives. Isaiah 53:7 again said, he was oppressed and he didn't open his mouth. So I wanted to translate it just a bit further, right? Is that not every attack deserves a response. See, real power isn't in need of defense. It reveals itself over time. See, at the cross, and this is where we get into where most people get this wrong during this time. Many people, they see pain. They see suffering. They also see defeat. But John 19 told us, he says, it's finished. That statement as it's finished was not a statement of weakness, but it was a statement of completion. See, the cross wasn't where power was lost. It was what appeared as defeat to some. It was purpose being fulfilled. And the part that nobody talks about is that silence. No applause when he's, headed to the tomb. No applause. No movement. No visible progress. And just because nothing is happening publicly doesn't mean nothing is happening spiritually. And this is where most people quit, because nothing looks like it's working. But what looks like a burial to some is actually a transformation. So let me give it to you clearly and how I understood it. Power is not given at the beginning. It's revealed. After you survive the process, and the process will test. It will test you. Oh yes, it's going to test your loyalty, your discipline, your obedience, and your identity. So let me give you the full process of power and the will of dying to lead, you will be fully established once you understand that, yes, you'll be betrayed, but you'll also be celebrated. You'll be pressured. You'll also be tested. There's moments when you will be misunderstood. But then there's moments in life when you're stretched. And when you have gone through all of those things, though that will occur before you ever become fully established. So let me ask you, are you walking away from pressure, or are you recognizing it as preparation? Because a lot of people are praying for elevation, but rejecting the very process that qualifies them for it. You know, there's a scripture that most people read, but they don't fully process this. But there's a passage of scripture that says, he will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. That's in Malachi 3 in the 3rd verse. And that means that before anything valuable is established, it has to be purified under pressure. So I'm going to take that a bit further. When you talk about a refiner, and if we had to question or interview a silversmith, and that smithsman would tell you that, you know, when you're refining silver, it goes through a unique process. This process is so unique because the silver is being melted down. But as the silver is being melted down, the smithsman never leaves the site of the silver being melted. The smithsman has to stay right there and can't move. Why? Because that smithsman would tell you that unless it can see his or her reflection in the silver, in the very thing that they're putting into the fire, it can't leave. See, if Christ had walked away from the process, there would be no fulfillment of the cross. No impact, no authority, no power. So, what makes you think that you can access power without pressure? Because you can't skip steps and still expect the authority. So, do understand something, that you're not being buried. You're being refined. You're being proven, and you're being prepared. And if you can endure the process, you won't have to chase power. It'll recognize you. This is the standard.